Hello, this is Chris Heasley with The Chris Heasley Show. Recently, I posted a video where I questioned the outcome, the integrity of local county elections in Fort Bend County in the recent primary runoff. And when I posted that video and questioned those election results, in other words, I raised a suspicion regarding them, I had a response from a former county official, from John Oldham, who is the former county elections administrator for Fort Bend County and a Republican. And his response was, quote unquote, in all caps, quit fear mongering. Whenever citizens question county elections, we are met by county officials with a condescending, finger wagging, patronizing response. And the purpose is to intimidate you, to shame you, to get you to be quiet, because they don't want anyone questioning county elections. They do this when us as citizens have over the years seen overt attempts by county officials to either interfere or overtake county elections. And I will give just a few examples. In 2020, Fort Bend County District Attorney Brian Middleton created the Elections Task Force, which would have put him in a perched position over county elections. He made this attempt until county residents stood up and questioned him on this. And when they questioned him on this, he had to put this effort down. The charade ended. But regardless, it showed an attempt by a county official to exert his influence over county elections. Also in 2020, in the county elections in Fort Bend County, they were a complete abject failure from a technology standpoint. In the 2020 Fort Bend County elections, the county officials admitted that the election machines received interference from cell phones, that there were 393 service tickets, that it required more than 28 IT professionals to operate these rudimentary machines, and that the machines were continually losing connections. So they admit all of these technology failures, but when you ask the question, okay, well, did the results come out as they should have? You're a bad person. How dare you ask that question? It's over and over again. Our county officials, these elections are questionable, but when you question, you're met with resentment from county officials. In a recent Harris County election, certain critical precincts turned up with a shortage in paper ballots, which affected county elections. One more overt attempt by county officials in Harris County to interfere with elections. But when you question the idea that they would do such a thing, you're met with resentment. And in a recent Fort Bend County election, the county officials actually lost an election machine. They lost it during the election. Was it in someone's closet? Was it tallying votes during that election? We don't know. And we never found out because, again, they don't want you asking these questions. So we're going to go back now and talk about the recent primary runoff in Fort Bend County. And in Fort Bend County, there are very questionable results in that election. And a rising suspicion amongst citizens, amongst residents, is that the results were inverted, where candidate A had his or her votes switched with candidate B, where the person who was sort of the political outsider somehow had a loss that made no sense. And we're going to get more into that, into our suspicions there. And on today's show, we have two guests. We have Brittanye Morris, who is a Democrat, who ran for county commissioner in Fort Bend County, and she lost. And they put her through an obstacle course just to be in that race. She's going to explain it all. And by the way, when they do that, that's called election interference. Brittanye Morris is an outsider. She questions the establishment, and she's not welcomed by the establishment. So we're going to have her tell her story. We also have Gary zoomed in on the line, and he's going to give more of a perspective on the potentiality of them interfering with these elections. And with that being said, Brittany, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Great. Thank you for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So tell me about yourself and tell me about your experience in running for the Fort Bend County Commissioner's spot.
Right. So it was a gauntlet from almost inception. Simple things such as when you file your application, you have to have a treasurer on file as well. So we brought, I had someone drop off those paperwork that were properly notarized and designated. And I was told that they couldn't accept the application until the treasury designation had been filed, which required you to go to a different building. So the Fort Bend County Democratic Party is in Sugar Land, and the place where you drop off your treasury designation or file it, you can do it either by email or drop it off in person. I was told since that was the deadline, it had to be dropped off in person, is by the old fairgrounds. Only to find out later that at least 2 candidates filed their treasury designation after their application had been accepted. So that was sort of the first step, but maybe things happen. I'm not really sure, but I kind of just brushed it off and continued to, fight the race. And I was successful in the primary. After the primary occurred.
So you won the primary?
It was 7 people contesting for that seat. So after the primary occurred, I came in first place out of the 7 people. And about 10 days later, a losing contestant filed a residency challenge, alleging that I didn't live in the county. Now, this particular candidate was supported by one of the establishment candidates, an elected official, if you will. And so, appointed to different committees by this particular elected official. So not only did this losing candidate want to play this legal battle out in the courtroom, they also wanted to play it out in the court of public opinion by getting the news stations and medias involved in this particular case. Unfortunately, I was not sued in that challenge. They sued the Democrat Party. Although I was a party in interest, I was never sued. I didn't even know they were going to trial. I knew a lawsuit had been filed, but from all indication, it looked like the Democrat Party's legal counsel was taking care of the issue. So I didn't know they had a trial coming up. Come to find out, they had a trial, and the lawyer for the Democrat Party was not successful. So at that point, I got a call stating that I needed to get counsel and work on either appellate remedies or other legal remedies to address the situation, which I did. I secured counsel immediately, and by the next day, we were filing motions in that particular case. So I did that. We took it to the Supreme Court, and they issued a stay to avoid the ruling that was issued at the trial court, and I got to continue on the ballot. I had a PR team as well. We sent this information to the news, but of course, it didn't get the same play as, the initial story. So there were people coming even on election day stating, "Oh, you don't live here. We saw it on the news." And I'm like, well, if you were watching the news a week later, the news retracted that statement. But they apparently didn't catch the, second iteration of that retraction. So from day one, it's definitely been a gauntlet. But in addition to that, on election day, 5 days of early voting. Then we had the Memorial Day holiday. So then on election day, about 2 p.m., mind you, voting starts at 7 a.m. There had been reports that the machines were not working. You saw social media littered with posts from people.
This is in the primary runoff.
Yes.
And so the general election was in March. The primary runoff was in May of 2026. And that's where the machines went down, correct?
Yes, in May of, the primary was in March, and then the runoff was in May.
Right.
And so May 26th, you saw social media flooded with people stating they could not vote. They thought they didn't know what was happening. They didn't know why their vote wasn't being cast. I was at the polls during that time. a lady walked up to me and said she had come from another voting location and she's going to try her luck here. So at that time, I always vote on election day. That's just sort of a tradition that I have. I went to go vote, and I too was turned away from voting. I was told the machines were down and they would be back up in about 15 to 30 minutes. So come back then. So I was waiting outside. That's when I met the lady. I let her know I was unable to vote, but please try your luck. She went in and she was turned away. So it hadn't been updated or fixed or whatever the issue was at that time. I then went to a different polling location. Same issue existed. And so at that point, there started to be rumblings internally. And it's about, I don't know, almost 4 at this point, that it was a countywide outage. And
so I want to make this clear. This is a primary runoff. This is a critical election. And during a primary runoff, the machines go down across the county. I don't know how that is not suspicious. Please. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So nobody knows why it's happening. Nobody knows it for a fact that it's everywhere. There's not unified information being given to the election workers because they're telling people to go to different locations, or people are going to different locations. I'd imagine if it was told, hey, this is countywide, they wouldn't waste their time or gas to go to a different, voting location and potentially incur the same problem. I understand that at some point provisional ballots were offered to some people at some time. Some people were told they could come back. So it was just the lack of uniformity in offering the provisional ballots and letting people know, this is everywhere. And so it caused, a lot of chaos. There was a lot of people standing in line. People are not familiar with provisional ballots. They either don't believe that their vote will be counted, or they don't want to take the time to fill out a hand ballot. So it's all these things are happening. You have confusion in the midst of people just not generally knowing what it is and believing to be properly registered. If they're offered a provisional ballot, that somehow seems like a slight, whether that's, factual or not. That's just how they feel in that moment. And it's not, the information isn't being translated to them in a way that they understand it. So you had numerous people walk away from voting. You had people who started filling out, at least from the Democrat primary, there's documentation that 57 people between 2 locations in particular, Bowie Middle School being one of them, and there's another location, that 57 people started a provisional ballot and never finished it. And so we don't know what the information we were told was, that the election judges there forgot to input the information or what have you. So we have a negative 57 on the face of the reconciliation from 2 voting locations and provisional ballots. So yeah, it's an interesting thing. Like I said, I tried to vote that day and trying to get to the bottom of it. So then the natural question people had was, are we extending the voting hours? We want to give people time. So about 6 o'clock, county officials, the election administrator, the Republican Party chair, and the county judge, they had a press conference. And during that press conference, they stated that there had not been an agreement to extend the voting hours at that time. They wanted to assure people by then the machines were 100% back to voting. So we're at 6 o'clock. And mind you, this started at about 2 p.m. So we're at 6 o'clock. The machines are back up. They were not sure if there was going to be an extension on voting. And they even urged people to go back and vote, get back in line and vote. So this is 6 p.m. Voting stops at 7. We have traffic. People have children. People have lives. All these sorts of things that could have been an impediment for them going back to cast their vote. And we don't know. We don't know who went back. There's not a good documentation, but one thing that was clear, that this was a mistake on the part of the election administration. They have cited that it was an a clerical error, a human clerical error. And the reason for this was that a manual update was pushed by somebody within the election administration office, and they pushed the voter update from a previous election. and that was May 2nd, a municipal election that we had in Fort Bend County for certain municipalities. They pushed that voter update into the system, and it took them over 3 hours to correct that so people could properly vote.
Okay. G2, did you hear what she just said about what the actual, say it one more time. How did they describe it?
A human error, a human clerical error. The voter file from a previous election, which was May 2nd, was uploaded into the system.
During a live election. Okay.
And it prevented voters from checking in to vote.
Okay, now I want to give John Odom's full response here. This is John Odom, former county elections administrator for Fort Bend County, a Republican. The update was to the electronic poll book, not to the voting system. It was done because the office received updates from the state team system on election day. The update would allow eligible voters to appear in the poll book. A department employee accidentally uploaded a file from the May city school elections instead of the primary runoff. Careless, but not malicious. And then in all caps, a message directly to me: quit fear mongering. And that's John Odom, former county elections administrator for Fort Bend County. Gary, tell me what your response is to all this.
You know, you hear these comments like quit fear mongering when you talk about elections. That's absolutely the wrong response. The truth of the matter is, nothing should be changing in those poll books on election day. This is the problem with electronic poll books, is that they can be manipulated through the day, and names could be added and taken out. In other instances, these electronic poll books are blocking people from voting because they suddenly disappear. This is just the wrong technology to use. The truth is, those polls, the data in the poll book, the voter roll.
G2 timed out. Okay, G2 timed out. So
Are supposed to be locked of the earlier election. Within a certain period, within a certain time in each election, the poll books have to be locked down. There should be no changes to poll books on election day. But there are other issues. So if you think about how some of these electronic machines can affect voting, there's a company called ESNS, for example, that was an option to be installed in their machines. And a number of years ago, they reported that thousands of machines were set out with a modem in them that weren't ordered. So the buyers didn't know that they had machines that could effectively be connected to the internet. And there's been a lot of testing on these election machines. And the reason there's so much concern about the machines is because they all operate on thumb drives. In other words, when they put the machine in the polling place and the ballots get scanned through, all of the data from those ballots is saved on a thumb drive. That means that the thumb drive put into the machine is on election day. And oftentimes they change that throughout election day. It doesn't matter what you tested in the machine, what you saw in the software. If you reviewed the software, make sure it was secure a month earlier, 2 weeks earlier. The minute a thumb drive goes in a computer, it can bring malware and new programs. Nobody knows what's on those thumb drives. Well, nobody except maybe the vendor's engineers. Now, in 2022, June 2022, there was a primary in Georgia. It was a Democrat primary, and there's a candidate named Michelle Long Spears. She voted for herself. Makes sense, right? But when she went and looked at the outcome of her election, she saw no votes in her precinct for her. Of course, that's impossible. Now, she assumes that her husband also voted for her, but we'll never really know. Right? When they went back to get a hand recount of the election, after she saw that she had 0 votes in her own precinct, she knew the numbers were in fact fake. When she called them for a hand recount, eventually one was done. And it turned out that she had lost 3,792 votes that simply were given to the other candidates. There were 3 candidates in that race. The first round of results showed candidate A as 1, B as 2, and Michelle Long Spears was 3. After the Heasley recount, Michelle Long Spears actually won the race. She went from position 3 to the number 1 in the winner. And the first one is remaining went to the third spot. Meaning the machines are completely reallocating the votes, and without a hand count of the ballots, without a hand count of the actual votes cast by customers or by voters, they would have no idea that she had actually won that race. She hadn't called for a recount and successfully compelled them to do it in the recount. She would have simply lost, and the wrong person would have been put in office. How did that happen? That happened with the machine. The first software to manipulate election outcomes used on electronic machines was more than 20 years ago. And it had impact in actual people. So the problem with election security is that you've got these electronic poll books to the part of the system, you've got machines that scan the ballot, you've got the tabulator, or the election management system that's at the county office. It pulls all of the results from all of the scanners together and reports those out to the election system and on its own. When we see elections, and we see sometimes the vote count for a candidate goes down, you have to ask why. And that's the immediate ground to stop the election and then count everything. So there's no question I've got significant concerns. It's an additional level of risk if you're using the ballot markers, the things where you have to free the vote.
There's no way for a voter to know which candidate they were recorded as voting for using a touchscreen machine. So those are some concerns. And when you hear about elections with outcomes that are expected or recounts that change outcomes, you know, these are some of the concerns and an example that explain how that happens.
Okay. My question for you is this. If we did a audit, if there was an actual audit of these elections done, would, if there is fraud happening, could it survive an audit? Could the potential fraud survive an audit?
It depends. So if you look at circumstances where ballots have been added to the system, and like mail-in ballots are added to the system, once a ballot's in the system, it's going to be counted. Recounting fraudulent ballots doesn't change the outcome. So the answer there would be yes. Or no, I guess no, it would not survive. You would not discover the fraud. If you've got people voting for other people, in other words, if mail-in ballots have gone out, and a lot of states use mail-in ballots, if mail-in ballots go out and the wrong person votes that ballot, there's no way for the state to know or the county to know who voted a mail-in ballot. It's impossible to know. They say, well, they're going to check signatures. It doesn't happen. It's an ineffective control. It doesn't work. If you're in a state where they don't use voter ID, and this is one of the critical elements of the Save America Act, if there is no demand for voter ID when you come into the polling place to vote, then no one in fact knows who's voting. What happens in some precincts is at the end of the day, when they see who hasn't voted, other people will go in and vote in the name of voters who didn't turn out. And that can change the outcome of elections. So it depends on the kind of fraud that's found. But if you've got good controls around your precincts and you don't have fake mail-in ballots, and you vote on a paper ballot, then you can do hand recounts and you can catch the fraud. But it is a complex system with lots of ways to cheat. Lots of ways are used to cheat. So the question, your answer, will an audit find the fraud, is maybe.
Okay, I want to talk about Save America Act in a minute, but before that, I want to talk about Aubrey Taylor. And Aubrey Taylor is a Democrat strategist in Harris and Fort Bend counties. He's a local guy. And he argues that this primary runoff was stolen from Al Green, or that's his suspicion at least. Now, we're not advocating for Al Green, and we don't agree with his position points, but we do want to know if people are casting votes for Al Green and they are taken away from him fraudulently, which we don't know if that's the case. We want that question exposed. Okay, so here's what Aubrey Taylor says about the Al Green versus Christian Menifee recent local election. Quote, how did Congressman Green go from beating Menifee in all 42 voting precincts in Fort Bend back in March to losing all 42 voting precincts in Fort Bend in May in the new race for the new 18th Congressional District of Texas? During the March 2026 Democrat Party primary, Congressman Green received 14,392 votes, which was 63% of the vote in Fort Bend County voting precincts. However, on Tuesday, in May of 2026, in the Democrat Party primary runoff, Al Green only received 4,264 votes for 36% of the vote in Fort Bend and lost all 42 precincts in Fort Bend to Christian Menifee. This does not make any sense. Comparatively speaking, Congressman Christian Menifee received only 6,572 votes, or 28% of the vote in Fort Bend County on March of 2026. However, in May of 2026, in the Democrat Party primary runoff, Christian Menifee received 7,463 votes, which is 63% in Fort Bend County, and won all 42 precincts, which is nearly impossible given that Al Green has represented the precinct for nearly 20 years. That's Aubrey Taylor. Now, one citizen spoke up, and I want to read their quote. Quote, "I've known Al Green a long time, since he was Judge Green. The Republicans might not like him, but Rep. Green is not unpopular in Houston. I find it hard to believe that Rep. Green lost to Menifee by that much, 65-36, especially since Menifee said he wanted to be the Houston Mondani. It started with the Fort Bend County poll breakdown for 4 hours and the mail-in votes, 65-35. That's the percentage in every race. Check it out. Now I want to repeat that, what this woman says. 65-35. That's the percentage in every race. Check it out. I want everyone to look into that quote. Brittany, tell me what you think.
Wow. So I guess let me be clear. I'm a Democrat. I have always been, never voted in a Republican primary, but it goes back to that quote from Malcolm X. I am for truth. I am for justice, no matter who's for or against it. And so here we definitely need to shed some light on it. We definitely need the truth of what happened. The person who was responsible, their name has never been publicly made available. I've requested incident reports.
When you say, what are you referring to right now?
So when we talk about the May 2026 primary runoff, there is a responsible individual. The county has identified that person, and they have not publicly released that person's name.
The person who did the upload.
The person who did the upload. Careless. I'm not inferring that there was something malicious, but at minimum, it was careless and negligent, for lack of a better term. And so they know who that person is, and they have not released their name. I've asked for incident reports. There are none. I asked for, reprimand reports, what was done. Is there remedial training for this person? None of that has been provided. I've been told it doesn't exist. And so if this was as careless and, negligent as it is, then of course there needs to be some remedial measures. They're taking remedial measures to make sure it doesn't happen again. However, to the person who actually supposedly pushed the wrong button on this upload, where is that person? What's been done? Have they been trained? Are they still with the county? And what is the reason for not providing full disclosure to the general public?
Yeah, so I went to vote, and when I went to the Fort Bend County, my local polling location, I was met by officials who said you can't vote because the machines are down. Immediately, I smelled a rat. I became suspicious. And yet, when I become suspicious, county officials like John Oldham tell me to quit fear-mongering, that there's something wrong with me. I am sorry. I question everything. Gary, what do you think? We're in the middle of a pivotal primary runoff election. The machines go down, and now we have Aubrey Taylor saying that potentially Al Green may have had his votes inverted or something done. There's questions about Brittany's race. There's questions about other precinct 4, correct?
Yes.
And the other race would be Adam Schoof versus Ken Matthews. Questionable results. What do you think, Gary?
Do you vote on ballots, paper ballots, or do you vote on touchscreens?
Touchscreens.
Okay. So it's very difficult to validate then the way votes were cast. If you look at the way the touch screens work, typically you touch the name of the candidate you want, and it prints out a piece of paper that then is scanned. It's a multiple step process. The thing is, what's scanned on the paper may be a machine readable code and not the names on the piece of paper that's printed. Assuming voters check the output to make sure the right names are printed. So I think that all of our elections are at risk. We're using equipment that shouldn't be used. And we see these strange outcomes all the time. Remember this election with the mayor, Karen Bass, in LA recently with this gentleman, Spencer Pratt. Spencer Pratt is running in the, I think, #2 position, and they're headed to a runoff. And somehow when all these mail-in ballots show up, suddenly this woman, Nitya Raman, goes from the 3rd position to the 1st position, to the 2nd position. And she does that with batches of mail-in ballots where she gets 100% of the vote. So somehow the distribution of votes in the mail-in ballots was completely different than anything that happened at the polls. It simply doesn't make sense. You might think they would have voted by mail more for Bass, but nobody voting for Pratt in some of the dumps of the ballots. It doesn't make sense. So we hear this thing about unlikely outcomes all the time. In this circumstance, I think there has to be a review of the equipment. You have to have a review of the ballots. You should test to make sure that when someone touches a screen, what is printed on the ballot is correct, and then what the scanner reads on that printed piece of paper is accurate, accurately read, because it matches what the voter can read. In other words, the names of the candidates they selected. You've got to do a thorough review of this system. And then once you establish that the system actually worked right, that the touchscreen was properly recording the vote, that the paper that was printed properly reflects that vote, then you do a manual recount. You get people in a room to hand count the ballots and validate the outcome.
Brittany, you told me earlier that you were confronted by a county official. Can you tell us about that?
So yes, this was prior to the May 26th runoff, and actually prior to the March 3rd primary election. I was confronted by a county official telling me I need to get my facts straight, telling me that I am disseminating, misinformation. And really what was said was races shouldn't be about nepotism. These are not seats that we own.
This is what you said. You made an argument that races should not be about nepotism. In
Yes.
other words, county officials shouldn't be trying to get their relatives, their brother, their mother, their aunt into positions and using their influence for allowing family members to have sort of a favored position for a county election.
Absolutely. This isn't, Old Town England. These aren't seats that are given by birth or succession. And so because of that, I don't think, nepotism in any shape, form, or fashion should come into these races. And that's a quote that I said during an interview, and I stand by that wholeheartedly. And so I was approached by an elected official who told me I need to get my facts straight. And that likely stems from, the I'll call it a rumor or the alleged relation.
You want to say the name of the official?
I think people will know who it is if they're local, that they were related to the candidate either by a blood or marriage. And so, again, that's not something that I started. That's not something that I even specifically stated during an interview. A simple statement of nepotism has no place in any race was met by brute force, for lack of a better term. And so imagine somebody of the opposite sex walking directly in your face and confronting you in a public forum. You have to imagine how that can make someone feel. It may make someone feel intimidated. It may make someone feel, uncomfortable at the very least. I mean, maybe it could be taken as a threat. Who knows? But that is something that I very much experienced.
That county official got in my face before, and it didn't last too long. I didn't back down. Gary, can you tell us what the Save America Act is?
Well, the Save America Act has a couple of primary goals. One, of course, is getting all the states to use photo ID. Now, I can tell you that people that I work with have absolutely verified that there is election fraud both with mail-in ballots and voting in person. And that is in person when there is no requirement for a photo ID. When you can simply walk in and say that I have, my name is Joe Smith, and I'm going to vote in Joe Smith's name, whether I'm Joe Smith or not. So the SAVE Act requires photo ID in federal elections. That's just smart. And it's something that polls at about 75 or 80% support among all voters, not Democrats, not Republicans or independents, all likely voters, no matter what party they're with. So that's just common sense. But there's another element to this that's also important. We know that across the country, foreign nationals vote in American elections, meaning people from other countries that are not United States citizens who happen to be in the United States legally or illegally are voting in US elections. Now, I know that there's a radical wing of the Democrat Party that thinks that's a good thing because they believe that those foreigners will vote for them. But the truth of the matter is, if I'm in France on election day, I don't get to vote. You know, and people from France ought not be able to vote here because they happen to be here on election day. Or worse, they're here illegally and they're working illegally and then they're voting illegally. So one of the requirements is that you have to prove citizenship to be registered. That's simply not the case in many places. Now that we have taken in some states to having registration for a driver's license at a Department of Motor Vehicles become a way to quickly and easily register for elections, to vote, get on the voter rolls, there must be another level of control to make sure that the people voting in our elections are doing so legally and that they're United States citizens. So the SAVE Act will require that. And we're hearing a lot of moaning and complaining about this. People actually say that certain groups of Americans aren't capable of getting IDs, which is pretty racist and insulting. Then they say, well, they're not capable of proving their citizenship. Again, racist and assaulting. But we have to start getting to a point where our elections are reliable and where these conversations end. Because it doesn't, it certainly matters that our elections be properly counted, that our ballots be secure, and that they be, and that the right candidates are awarded the win. But it's also important that we believe the system works, because when the public believes the system doesn't work, they check out. If you go back to 2024, in that election, a majority of voters believed election fraud would affect the outcome. So we've got to fix the system, and the SAVE Act does those two things and a few other things that will help to make our system more secure. There's no process that the county governments, the state governments, or the federal government run that's more important than elections. And yet it's the process they say you can't audit, you can't validate, we use vulnerable equipment, documented vulnerabilities are ignored. You wouldn't do that in any company with a process. You wouldn't do that at a bank in a process where you're cashing checks and affecting account balances. This is the only critical process in the United States where we're told you cannot audit it, you cannot improve controls, you cannot make it more secure, you cannot validate the identification of the person who is voting. This is ludicrous. So the Save America Act is a critical element of improving our security. It's not perfect, but it would improve the security of our election systems, and that's why it should pass. And I suspect that's why it's not getting through the Senate. Because if you look at some of these senators, you have to ask, who's voting for them? How do they hold those seats? The harder they fight against secure elections, the more it seems maybe they're dependent on election fraud to get elected. It's just time for them to stop, to serve the citizens, and pass the Save America Act. The weaknesses in that act can be dealt with later, but we have got to secure our election process.
Brittany, do you have an opinion on the Save America Act?
Generally speaking, it's not something that someone from my side of the aisle would jump at happening. But I do think there's a need to make sure we have fair and free elections. That's what this country was built on. That's what so many people have fought and died for the right to have. So figuring out how we can do this and make it the least restrictive as possible, and making sure we're not imposing additional burdens on those people who want to exercise their civic rights.
I agree. And I think that elections are the most critical, possibly the most critical issue, because I believe that when elections get fixed, these endless wars stop. I think everything from the endless wars to the insane, unbalanced budgets, the insane spending, to even our potholes in our streets, everything gets fixed from soup to nuts, from top to bottom across the board. Brittanye, we're going to close it out, and I let you have the closing comments. Tell us what you think about what we need to do with elections going forward. Tell me if you have any more sentiments on what happened to you in your county election and what your goals are going forward.
Yeah, so at this point, we're trying to identify people from the May 2026 election who tried to vote and were turned away. Were told to come back in 30 minutes or told to come back later, or tried to go to a couple of polls and it just didn't work out. We're trying to identify those individuals to make sure that that is noted, their voice is heard, and that way we can make the appropriate changes. There are, to the election administrators' credit, there are some safeguards that they're trying to implement for the next election, which is great, but we do have to fix what's already been done. So again, if reach out to Chris, if you were one of those people that were affected who ultimately did not get to cast your vote in the election of May 2026. And I would love to hear from you. We need to let people know that people were affected by this incident, no matter how careless it's categorized or negligent that it's categorized. People still were disenfranchised and harmed. And that's the biggest thing. Yeah.
Great.
Thank
Very
you.
good. Well, I want to thank you, Brittanye, for being on the show, and I really enjoyed having you on the show. And Gary, thank you for chiming in on all the national topics. And with that being said, thank you. This is Chris Heasley with the Chris Heasley Show. We will be back next week with one more hot topic. Have a great week.